Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, back with another video. So, I believe I mentioned in either my last video or the one before it that I was considering doing some prediction videos this week for some of the fights that were coming up on the schedule. So, I looked at the schedule and tried to figure out what fights to talk about. And if truth be told, there isn't really anything coming up in the next month or so that really interests me. There's not really a whole lot of fights. And yeah, there really isn't much to talk about. The one that everybody's talking about, of course, is the Crawford fight, but I already made a video about that and already covered it and made my opinions on it known. So yeah, you guys that have been following the channel will know what I think about that. Don't really have anything else to say about it. One fight that did kind of catch my attention though, and it's probably the only fight coming up in the next month or so that I, for whatever reason, find intriguing, is the fight that's taking place on the undercard of the Crawford fight, the heavyweight fight between Andy Ruiz, who is making a comeback after about 2 years of inactivity. You know, he hasn't fought since he fought Luis Ortiz back in 2022. And he's going to be fighting Jarrell Miller, who, of course, in his last fight got absolutely demolished and had the first loss of his career against Daniel Dubois. So yeah, we've got two guys here who actually have a lot in common. However, there is a few major differences between the two, as I'll discuss in this video. So the reason I wanted to talk about this fight, and the main reason why this fight intrigues me, is because under normal circumstances, I wouldn't really have a lot to say about it. But going into this fight, there's a certain amount of uncertainty, isn't there, about both guys? Like, we really don't know what form each of these guys is going to be in. And there's a very, very clear reason for that. So, before I get into talking about how I think the fight's going to go and how it should go, I just want to say that basically, assuming both of these guys are at their absolute best, let's say that I knew for certain that both of them were going to be on form, both of them were coming off momentum, both of them were going to train to the best of their ability, and both of them were going to be just the equivalent of their best night and their best performance, then I would be very, very confident in picking Andy Ruiz to win the fight on points. And the reason that I say that is because you've got two guys who are very, very similar in a lot of ways. They're, of course, both big guys. They're both fat guys. You know, they're both morbidly obese, essentially. You know, and they're both guys who, I guess, in some ways resemble each other physically, right? They've clearly got a similar sort of diet, right? But the thing that separates the two guys for me is in how they approach the sport, because they're two very, very different styles. Now, if you look at Jarrell Miller, and I've talked about this before, in my opinion, Jarrell Miller is purely a physical fighter. And what I mean by that is, he's a guy who 100%, without a shadow of a doubt, relies on his physical ability to win fights, okay? He relies on his size. I mean, the guy weighs over 300 pounds and is a very big, strong, heavy individual, right? He relies on his size, his strength, his durability, his work rate, and his overall toughness and physicality to win fights, right? Going into a fight, he has to be the bigger guy, the stronger guy, the heavier guy, and he has to be able to apply relentless pressure to a smaller opponent to beat them down to where they have nothing left and where he can force a stoppage, right? That's essentially how Jarrell Miller fights. It's how he approaches fights. There's nothing scientific about him. There's nothing technical about him. There's nothing tactful about him. There's nothing subtle about him. He's just a brute, right? He's a pure, big, fat, heavy, durable, tough, somewhat energetic for his size brute, right? That's what he is. He's in there to put it on you and break you down. Now, you compare him to Andy Ruiz, again, a guy who has certain physical attributes that are very similar, okay? Fat guy, heavy guy, you know, pretty durable in his own right. But that's not how Andy Ruiz approaches fights. You know, Andy Ruiz is a much more tactful fighter. You know, he takes a tactical approach to his fights. And a good example of that, of just the kind of mentality that Andy Ruiz has, is if you look at his last fight where he fought Luis Ortiz. Andy Ruiz went in there despite being the younger guy and, the heavier guy and stuff like that. Andy Ruiz didn't just charge forward and try to overwhelm Luis Ortiz. No, what Andy Ruiz did was he sat on the outside, very patient, maintained a high guard, tried to establish distance, but held the center of the ring and applied slow but steady pressure and used his jab and his lead hand to try to set up opportunities. Tried to force Luis Ortiz to take the lead so that Luis Ortiz, who has a low guard and who's of course old and past his prime and doesn't have great reflexes, isn't that fast. Basically, Ruiz was trying to draw a lead from him and force him to make mistakes and then capitalize on those mistakes by jumping in and landing punches. Kind of an ambush fighter in sorts. He's a low volume, effective pressure fighter, essentially. But he's not a guy who's going to go in there and just try to overwhelm you with pressure, and with volume. So yeah, two guys are very, very different. You've got a tough guy and a more of a high volume fighter and a guy who uses his size versus a guy who uses his brain and tries to outthink you. And based on Andy Ruiz having the more well-schooled background, he has a much more extensive amateur background. He's a guy who goes into the fight with a genuine game plan to try and outthink and outbox you. And I'm not here to pretend that he's brilliant or anything like that. I'm not saying that Andy Ruiz is an elite fighter. I'm not even saying that he's a top-level heavyweight, because personally I've never rated him like that. But I just think that compared to Jarrell Miller, he has the kind of intelligence and he would have the kind of tactical preparation to win against a guy like Jarrell Miller. That's obviously assuming that the fight's on the up and that both guys are at their absolute best. I would definitely be very confident in picking Andy Ruiz to win on points. What I wouldn't do, however, is I wouldn't pick Andy Ruiz to win by stoppage, because Andy Ruiz doesn't have that kind of power. He doesn't hit anywhere near as hard as someone like Daniel Dubois. In addition to that, he's not as naturally big as Daniel Dubois. He's much shorter and has shorter arms, so I can't see him putting a beating on Miller from long range. I think he would have to just peck at Jarrell Miller from the outside, jab to the body, make Jarrell Miller miss, and try to counter him and capitalize on his defensive lapses and his mistakes and try to win on points. I think that's what would happen with both of these guys at their best. However, this isn't both of these guys at their best, is it? Because Andy Ruiz, just thinking back to his last fight where he fought Luis Ortiz, and I don't think I made a video about the fight at the time, but I think I did mention this in several comment sections, if I remember rightly, and it definitely was on my mind at the time. And that is the fact that in the aftermath of that fight, and I'm talking about as soon as the fight ended, Andy Ruiz to me looked incredibly dejected. Now, if you look at that fight very carefully, an argument could be made that Ruiz lost that fight. Now, obviously he was the A side fighting at home, and he was able to score 3 knockdowns, which of course secured him the decision on the scorecards. The knockdowns were the difference on the official scorecards for that fight. But if you ignore the knockdowns and just look at the action throughout, Andy Ruiz took a lot of heavy punches in that fight, and he actually gassed in the later rounds of that fight, which for me shows that Andy Ruiz at that stage of his career, I think his poor diet and his poor lifestyle choices were starting to catch up with him a little bit. And I just felt, just based on his body language, how he behaved in the post-fight interview and as the scorecards were being read out and stuff like that, Andy Ruiz looked to me a little bit jaded and a little bit fed up with boxing. And it wasn't at all surprising to me that he disappeared into obscurity and didn't fight for the next 2 years, because I partially expected him to want to just cash out after that fight, because I think what Andy Ruiz came to the realization of was the fact that if he ever wants to become champion again, or if he ever wants to get to the highest level of the heavyweight division again, he's going to have to make some major sacrifices You know, the things that he could get away with in his early 20s, he's not going to be able to get away with those things now. You know, he can't get away with gaining 30 pounds between fights, you know, weighing in at what, 260, 265, and then weighing nearly 300 pounds just a couple of months later, and having to lose it all again before his next fight. He's not going to be able to get away with that in his 30s. And, you know, as he gets older, as his sort of body mechanics start to deteriorate, you know, he starts to lose muscle mass and starts to gain more excess body fat and stuff like that. He's not going to be able to get away with that anymore. And I think he realised that in the Luis Ortiz fight. I think he realised that age and poor lifestyle decisions were starting to catch up with him. And I think he just decided he wanted to cash out because as far as I can tell, one of the main reasons for his inactivity was the fact that he priced himself out of several fights, or so I've heard anyway. He priced himself out of several fights, like he was in talks to fight Deontay Wilder, and he backed out of that. He was in talks to fight Tyson Fury, he backed out of that. Both of them would have been fights where there would have been huge opportunities for him. And they could have also been, you know, really, really big money fights. But it seemed to me like Andy Ruiz wanted to get paid his pension, essentially. He wanted a retirement fund because he really didn't have the motivation to make the kind of sacrifices that he needs to make to be the best fighter he could be and to be as good an athlete as he could be. And, you know, it's just very typical of people who have morbid obesity. You know, it's very, very difficult to change your eating habits. It's very, very difficult to turn your life around when you've been in such a bad state for so many years. And I think that that's what's happened with Ruiz. I just don't think we're ever going to see him in shape ever again. You know, like when he fought Chris Arreola, he worked so hard to lose weight for that fight. And he ended up going into that fight getting dropped and going the distance against a 40-year-old Chris Arreola. So in his mind, he kind of thought, or I'm assuming anyway, in his mind, he kind of thought, I put all that effort into losing weight, but didn't do it correctly. And basically the results weren't any better than when I was morbidly obese. So he goes into his next fight after that against Luis Ortiz and looks horrible, looks to have gained weight again. So yeah, I think it's a vicious cycle with Andy Ruiz, and I just don't think we'll ever see him fully motivated. I don't think he even trains anymore, like at least not training to the level what he would need to be a top-level heavyweight. So that's playing on my mind when I think about this Jarrell Miller fight, because like I mentioned earlier in the video, Jarrell Miller is the kind of fighter who relies on his weight. He relies on his size. He thrives on being the bigger, heavier, more durable man. And he has the stamina to be able to fight at a decent pace for 12 rounds while being so big. Now, there's an open question there because he did get stopped on his last fight. And since failing those drug tests after the Anthony Joshua debacle, he definitely hasn't looked as tenacious or as overly aggressive. He doesn't seem to have that roid rage about him anymore, does he? So there's a certain amount of uncertainty going into this fight with him. Like, we don't know if he'll have fallen off the rails and neglected training and gained even more weight and stuff like that. We don't know if that beating he took against Daniel Dubois has had an effect on him. Because let's not forget, Jarrell Miller is a fighter who has practically no defense and has been getting hit numerous times in his career. Like, every time he fights, he has to absorb an excessive amount of punishment in order to get the job done. So there's a very good chance that he might be punch drunk, or that he might be in a similar situation physically and mentally to Ruiz. You know, he might just think, what is the point? You know, I'm never going to be a top heavyweight. I might as well just cash out. So yeah, there's a very good chance that Jarrell Miller might not be Jarrell Miller in this fight. We don't know how he's going to rebound from the loss and all the setbacks he's had. So for me, that makes this fight very, very interesting. I think it's going to be a very slow-paced fight, actually. Like, I think both guys are going to be somewhat tentative, because I think Ruiz is going to do what he always does. I think he's going to hang about on the outside and try to counter and wait for opportunities. And he's gonna understand, like he did in the Ortiz fight, that he can't be as aggressive and fight Mexican style like he used to. He's not going to be able to fight the way he did in the early stage of his career, where he could come in nearly 300 pounds and throw punches with blistering hand speed, brutal combinations. He can't do that anymore. He's too old, and he's had too many setbacks. So yeah, I just think that Ruiz is gonna try and be tactful. I think he's gonna try and peck away with that jab, jab to the body, stay on the outside, but occasionally edge forward and apply some pressure. And I think Jarrell Miller is going to try in the early rounds to impose his size on Ruiz, and I think he's going to try and break Ruiz. But personally, I think that Ruiz has the experience and the technical know-how to be able to deal with it. It's just, I'm not so sure if Ruiz is going to take the fight seriously. Like, I just, when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking of the aftermath of that Ortiz fight, and just how dejected Ruiz looked, and how he was deluding himself about how, telling himself that gaining all that weight helped him, it made him more durable, which is complete nonsense, okay? But being morbidly obese isn't going to give you any advantage at all, particularly in a fight like this. You're going to have to be more light on your feet. You're going to have to be stronger. You're going to have to be fitter. You're going to have to be more athletic. That would help Ruiz to circle Miller on the outside and then jump in with quick, short anaerobic bursts. It would help him to do that if he could drop some of that weight that he's carrying around. But I don't know, man. It's uncertain. Andy Ruiz is not reliable. He could show up to the first AJ fight, really motivated, raring to go, putting on a great performance. Then he shows up to the next fight like 20 pounds heavier and barely does a thing the entire fight, just walks around the ring like a big blob. Yeah. But, I mean, it's an interesting fight, it is. But like I said, under normal circumstances, I would favour Ruiz to win on points. And I think if you had a gun to my head and you forced me to make a prediction, I would still pick Ruiz on points, but I think it's going to be very hard. I think he's going to really struggle to get through it. I think Jarrell Miller's going to make the fight ugly and scrappy, and I think Ruiz is maybe going to take a beating in the later portion of the fight, because he doesn't have the power that Daniel Dubois has. So I think Ruiz is going to outbox Miller. I think he's going to capitalise on Miller's non-existent defence, on his poor punching technique and stuff like that. But I think the longer the fight lasts, the more it's going to favour Miller, who just has better stamina in general, or at least has shown better stamina throughout his career than Ruiz has. But I think Ruiz is going to build up a bit of a lead in the early part of the fight. And I presume that Ruiz is going to be the A-side here. So I'm going to favour Ruiz to win a close fight, competitive fight. I think he wins it on points. I think it's going to be more fast-paced and less of a snooze fest than the Luis Ortiz fight was. Because in the Luis Ortiz fight, you had two guys who were relatively cautious and low volume, whereas with Jarrell Miller, he's a guy who's going to throw high volume because he's going to know that he needs to in order to win the fight, because he can't outbox Ruiz under usual circumstances. So I'm going to go with Ruiz. It's interesting to me, look, Andy Ruiz, I've actually been looking, just based on the fact that he's making a comeback, I've been looking into him a lot lately, and as somebody who has struggled with weight myself, and, who, at this point in time, going on kind of I guess you could call it, I don't know, man, a fitness journey, whatever you want to call it. It's given me a very, very good insight into the psychology of people who have obesity, right? It's given me kind of an insight into that, and as a result of it, I find Andy Ruiz somewhat fascinating, if truth be told. What I find more so fascinating is the fact that he's been as successful as he is, and has been able to reach the level he's reached while being literally morbidly obese. And it just makes me wonder, and obviously I'm not alone in this, a lot of people have wondered, how good could Andy Ruiz have been if he actually took the sport seriously and trained and had a healthy diet? He could have been an elite fighter, but at this stage of his life, I doubt that'll ever happen. So, yeah, I'm going with Ruiz on points, but I think he's going to really struggle to make it the distance, and I think he's going to take a beating towards the end of the fight, but I think he's going to build up enough of a lead early on to win the fight on points, but I think it's going to be close and competitive. So yeah, that's how I see the fight, and I'm not at all confident, because again, I don't know what that beating in the Dubois fight has taken out of Jarrell Miller, and I don't know how he's going to respond to it. And I don't know what shape or what kind of mindset Andy Ruiz is going to be in. So, yeah, I'm going with Ruiz on points, but not at all confident in it. But it's an interesting one, to say the least. So, yeah, let me know what you guys think anyway. Stay tuned for more videos. Let me know in the comment section what you think is going to happen in this fight. Thanks for watching, and God bless.